Ahoy, and welcome to Prague, and welcome to another episode of the Mars Guide. Now, apologies for the delay in this second video, but I had COVID and then tourists started coming back to Prague, so I'm getting back to the day job, and it's refreshing to begin to see things opening up. So in the second part, we're going to look at the liberation of Prague in May 1945 and try and answer some of the questions that arise quite naturally from the first part. What did the uprising achieve? What were the American Secret Service doing in Prague at that time? What happened to the ROA, or the Russian Liberation Army, that fought with the Czechs against the Nazis? Why was history rewritten by the communists, and what was the aftermath? And finally, just what did any of this have to do with the Japanese? Answers coming up. So in May 1945, Hitler was dead and Berlin had surrendered, and the Czechs started to pull down German signs, waiting for the Nazis to go home. On May the 5th, 1945, Zdeněk Mančal, a broadcaster with Czech radio, started broadcasting in Czech. The Nazis tried to take the radio station, and the Czechs built barricades, and street fighting broke out between the Nazis and the citizens of Prague. The Nazis sent more troops because the Nazis didn't want to surrender to the Soviets, but rather to the Americans in the West, and the route to that surrender was through Prague. Things went okay at first, but got better through the intervention of the ROA, the Russian Liberation Army, who were a group of disaffected Soviets who decided to fight for the Nazis against the Russians. But as the Nazis had lost the war, the ROA found themselves in a bit of a limbo. They were going west to surrender to the Americans, and at the time of the Prague Uprising, they were not far from Prague, and they were persuaded to join the fight against the Nazis and try and look like the good guys. However, the Czechs were worried that their Soviet liberators, i.e. Stalin, would be upset with them because he thought the ROA were traitors. So the Czech resistance began to distance themselves from the ROA. Understandably, the ROA were upset and packed up and went. But for the uprising, it couldn't have come at a worse time. On May the 7th, the temperature was turned up even further, since in Reims, France, Alfred Jodl had just signed the unconditional surrender that stated the following day, May the 8th, all German troops must put down their weapons and surrender in the place where they happened to be. With the Soviets advancing from the east, that wasn't an option, so the Nazis needed to break through the Czech defences. In Prague, the shelling intensified from places like Letna Hill. Tanks fired at and burned out the old town hall and the astronomical clock. The Nazis began to massacre the Czech population whenever they were given the opportunity to do so. For example, they drove the Czech people in front of the tanks against barricades, and if people wanted to escape, they would be shot without mercy. As the fighting intensified the next day, the question was repeatedly asked, where are the Americans? They were only 80 kilometers from Prague. Why weren't they coming to the rescue? They had made calls in English for help. Had no one heard them? Yes, someone had. General George Patton. Patton was commander of the Third Army that had crossed the Czech border, but was ordered only to go as far as Plzeň, and it was connected to the agreement made at Yalta between the Big Three, Stalin, Roosevelt and Churchill, in February 1945. Essentially, it was agreed at that meeting that Prague would be liberated by the Red Army and not the US forces. It is said that the Cold War started at Yalta, but historian David Reynolds argues that the shape of Europe had been decided before Yalta, in effect because the Soviets had fought their way west and practically all of Eastern and Central Europe was now under their control. But by Yalta, the Big Three each came with their own agenda. Stalin wanted a buffer zone on Russia's borders so it wouldn't be invaded again, and to maintain a sphere of political influence in the region. Churchill was completely obsessed with Poland, as the UK had drawn the sword for Poland and had declared war on Germany after it invaded Poland in 1939. In addition, many Poles had fought with the British troops, particularly in Italy, and Churchill wanted to fulfill his pledge for a post-war free and democratic Poland. The US President Roosevelt wasn't too concerned with Europe at that time. He was much more focused on Japan. The Japanese were formidable, often fanatical opponents, and knowing how hard the Japanese had fought, the Allies realised that in order to defeat Japan, they would have to take it island by island, and that would probably mean huge casualties. 25,000 US troops died taking the small volcanic island of Iwo Jima alone. So as Stalin agreed to send forces to help the US 3 months after Germany was defeated, the US very much wanted to keep Stalin sweet. And if Stalin wanted the prize of liberating Prague, he was going to get it. Also, at the same meeting, Stalin, in order to keep Roosevelt and Churchill sweet, promised free and full elections in the territories now under their control. But by May 1945, Churchill had woken up to the fact that Stalin was lying and urged the US to liberate Prague. He warned that if the Soviets took Prague, it would completely change the post-war situation in this country and could also affect the situation in neighbouring states. He warned that if it did not work out, the Czechoslovak Republic could go the way of Yugoslavia, that is, to become a communist regime. The US State Department were in favour of Churchill's idea, but the new President Truman, who had taken office after Roosevelt's death in April 1945, felt it wasn't his place to interfere in something that had already been agreed. And did he really want to sacrifice more US soldiers' lives in order to take Prague? Nonetheless, Eisenhower, known as Ike, sent a telegram to his Soviet counterpart, General Antonov, on May the 4th requesting to move and liberate Prague. But Antonov told him that the Russians had already mobilized and were about to advance on the city, and it would be safer because they didn't want anyone dying because of friendly fire as had happened in Yugoslavia. With Patton straining like a dog at the leash and desperate to take Prague, he phoned Omar Bradley, one of Eisenhower's generals, and said, "I'm going to lose contact with you now, and I'll give you a report on my status of my troops from the phone booth on Wenceslas Square tomorrow." Once again, in no uncertain terms, the feisty general was told to hold his position, and under no circumstances was he to advance any further. Although the US troops were stopped in Plzeň, 2 Americans, Lieutenant Eugene Fodor and Sergeant Kurt Taub, who worked for the OSS, which was a precursor to the CIA, heard about the calls for help and decided to head to Prague to see what was happening. In Prague, they had a meeting with the Czechoslovak National Council, the CNC, and they told the assembled group that it was possible they could persuade the Americans to advance on Prague. The proposal, it turns out, was not well received by some members of the CNC, particularly Josef Smrkovsky, who was a committed communist. The feeling of the 2 OSS officers was that the communists didn't want the US to liberate Prague, for the communists knew very well that if Prague was liberated by the Red Army and not the Americans, it would give them a huge political advantage. They wanted the Soviets to be seen as the liberators for all the reasons the Soviets would use in their propaganda after the war. In retrospect, the officers admitted that it was a naive attempt to try and somehow influence the post-war shape of Europe, but perhaps like Patton, they didn't know what had been agreed at Yalta. On May the 8th, things were getting worse for the Nazis because essentially time was running out. The Czech National Council, realizing that no help was coming from the Americans, that supplies were dwindling, and fearful that the trapped Nazis would systematically destroy Prague and murder as many citizens as possible, entered into negotiations with the Nazis. The meeting between the commander of the Prague Uprising, General Karel Kuttelwasser, forced the head of the Wehrmacht in Prague, General Rudolf Toussaint, to sign the surrender on the afternoon of May the 8th, 1945. Kuttelwasser remembered that after signing the surrender, Toussaint burst into tears and said, "I am personally completely destroyed. I have lost everything, homeland, family, and everything else." Then Toussaint's son was let into the room. He had been captured earlier by the insurgents. The reunion, it said, was touching. Whether or not Toussaint knew before the negotiations began that the insurgents had his son, and that is what brought him to the negotiating table, I've not been able to determine. But it's certainly possible, given how Toussaint felt. When the insurgents knew that their prisoner was Toussaint's son, many wanted to execute him, but he was saved, possibly because he would be more used to the insurgents alive than dead. Interestingly, this story has another twist, because after the war, Kuttelwasser and Toussaint would meet again, but, as we shall see, in very different circumstances. When the first Soviet tanks from the 1st Ukrainian Army under the command of General, later Marshal Koněv, arrived in Prague in the early hours of May the 9th, there was not much opposition, since the Nazis had packed up and headed at speed to surrender to the Americans in the West. The Red Army completed what was essentially a mopping-up operation, rooting out and neutralizing those last pockets of Nazi resistance from the mainly fanatical Waffen-SS. They arrived about 4 in the morning, and between 9 and 10 a.m. Marshal Koněv declared that Prague had been fully liberated. It is estimated that about 30 Soviet troops died in the liberation of the city, but putting it into perspective, about 145,000 Soviet troops died on the journey to Prague. Zdeněk Manšel welcomed them in his broadcast. That unit of the famous Red Army have entered the territory of liberated Prague. A further radio announcement welcomed the Soviet troops' arrival in Prague. Long live the Czechoslovak Republic! Long live the Soviet Union and its Red Army! Long live Marshal Koněv! Glory to the great Stalin! The arrival of the Red Army meant that essentially the fighting in Prague was over in the Czech lands. Some die-hard Nazis refused to surrender and fought their way west to get to the American demarcation line. The last battle between the Nazis and the Soviets occurred at the Battle of Slivice on May the 12th, 1945.
After the liberation of Prague, the reprisals began. About 300 Germans were brutally murdered. Czech collaborators were rounded up, some killed, others publicly humiliated. The Soviets then began looking for the members of the ROA. At around 5 o'clock that day, General Pavel Ryblako arrived for a meeting with the insurgents, and when he saw that the communist Josef Smrkovsky was present, he immediately accused him of collaborating with the enemies of the Soviet people. Then, in a fit of rage, he drew his pistol and waved it menacingly in the front of Smrkovsky's face. When he had calmed down, the Czech National Council asked if the general could treat the Vlasovci humanely, since without doubt they had saved the blood of the Praguers. Rybalko was unmoved, but after more pressure from the council, he replied, "Well, I promise I won't shoot all of them." At the hospital in Motol, about 190 severely wounded Vaslov soldiers were dragged from their beds and murdered. Vaslov and Bunyachenko were captured by the Soviets and later tried and hung for treason. Many of the ROA who managed to surrender to the Americans were returned to the Soviets, where later they were executed or sentenced to lengthy terms in gulags.
So what did the uprising achieve? Maybe it was to prove that the Czech resistance was just as good as it had been in other countries. It is true that the Czechs perhaps weren't as proactive, but they did achieve one of the biggest assassinations of the war, which was that of Reinhard Heydrich, the architect of the final solution, in May 1945. Maybe it was because of all that pent-up anger at having been occupied and terrorized by the Nazis for nearly 6 years, and all that anger and hate and revenge came just spilling out onto the streets of Prague, and in turn it had a unifying effect on the country, and thousands were keen to join the fight. It boosted their morale, encouraged by the fact that they knew it would all soon be over, and that things can only get better. Yeah. Heard that before. Also, some argue it was a way to defend their country. Hitler issued an ARLZ order stating that German troops were to use the scorched earth tactics in retreating, that is, to destroy everything they left behind, and the Czechs were aware of that based on what had happened in Lidice and Ležáky. And I guess lastly, as the Soviets were so keen to be seen as the liberators of Prague, it speeded up their efforts to get to Prague, particularly before the Americans. And what about the Russian Liberation Army, the ROA? Again, it had a significant impact on the course of the uprising. Without the ROA, the uprising would have been crushed very quickly. There would have been a bloodbath, and Prague could have ended up being systematically destroyed, as the Nazis had done in Warsaw in the previous year. The ROA intervention prevented a complete liquidation of the Czech insurgents and prevented the massacre of thousands of Czech citizens, and eventually brought the Nazis to the negotiating table. Historians, Czech and Russian, argue whether the ROA were heroes. The Russians argue they were just opportunists who decided to switch sides at a convenient time because they wanted to look like the good guys. The Czechs recognise their contribution, but some also argue they were not heroes because at the end of the day they fought on the side of the Nazis. What is clear, however, that without the intervention of the ROA, things would have turned out very differently. As soon as the Soviets entered Prague, the whitewash, the rewriting of history began because, as feared by Churchill, Czechoslovakia would be politically influenced by Moscow that would lead it to ultimately become a communist regime. The Soviets wanted to make it clear to the Czechs and the world that they, and they alone, had brought about the liberation of Prague. Already they had killed off the surviving members of the ROA. They then turned their attention to others involved in the uprising, who they felt had betrayed the Soviet Union and their country by allowing the Nazis to escape and surrender to the Americans. For his crimes, General Kutlvacher was arrested and imprisoned in 1945 and spent 12 years in jail. It was in prison that he ran into Rudolf Toussaint, the very man who had commanded the Wehrmacht in Prague. Toussaint had been imprisoned for crimes against the Czechs during the Prague Uprising. Also, sometime later, in a communist prison, Toussaint came across the vice president of the insurgent Czech National Council, the communist Josef Smrkovský, who, if you recall, was desperate for the Red Army to liberate Prague. The irony had not escaped Toussaint. But Mr. Smrkovský, I thought the communists had won the uprising. Smrkovský had been arrested and imprisoned following the communist purges of the 1950s. Also, after the communist coup in 1948, Zdeněk Mančal, the announcer who it said started the uprising, was finally detained and sentenced to 3 years in prison for his anti-state activities. His crime was that as part of the Czech National Council, he had played a role in starting the uprising, and that in one of his broadcasts he'd made a mistake in that he said, "That unit of the famous Red Army have entered the territory of liberated Prague." You have to remember, it is the Red Army who liberated Prague. After the communists took control here in 1948, the role of the Russian Liberation Army was expunged, deleted from the Czech history books. Children in schools never heard anything about the role they had played in stopping the uprising being crushed very quickly by the Nazis. It was only after the Velvet Revolution, some 40 years later, that the facts began to be known. In addition, the Soviets perpetrated the myth of their major role. They donated a tank that had allegedly been part of the Red Army entering Prague on the morning of May the 9th, and it was placed in the Kinsky Square, which was renamed Soviet Tankers Square. It stayed there until it was removed after the Velvet Revolution, but again, in the rewriting of history, it was the wrong type of tank and it had the wrong number. Also, where the rest of the world celebrate VE in Europe as May the 8th, or Victory in Europe as May the 8th, and the communist regime here it was May the 9th, because that is the day when the Red Army liberated Prague. In another part of Prague, they erected a statue to Marshal Koněv in 1980, while this was still a communist country. Now, its presence today, or has in recent years, become quite controversial, leading to an international diplomatic spat between the Czech Republic and the Russian Federation. Some saw or see his statue as an insult, since Koněv had played a role in the invasion of Hungary in 1956. He was commander of the Soviet forces in East Germany during the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961, and that he helped plan the invasion of Czechoslovakia and the crushing of the Prague Spring in 1968. Still a very sensitive subject here. The eventual removal of the statue in 2020 drew criticism from many quarters, including the then Czech President Miloš Zeman and the Russian Foreign Ministry. They objected, saying that Czech politicians were initiating a war with the symbols of the victory over fascism. And finally, what of the Japanese? Well, as I'm sure you're aware, the US didn't need and deep down didn't want the help of the Soviets because it would allow them another potential area of influence in Asia. And through the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, it forced an unconditional surrender from the Japanese, and so the Soviets were no longer required. Perhaps then, if the US had had the bomb at the time of the Yalta Agreement, things in Prague and the Czech lands might have turned out very differently. So there we are. That is our lengthy look at the Czech National Uprising of 1945, with an emphasis on the events in Prague. I hope you found it interesting. If so, please do click and subscribe, and don't forget to press the little bell button so that you get future notifications. Once again, thank you for watching, and see you next time.